Hi, I'm Dixie and I am back again with yet another historical corset making project. This time it's a new to me era, the 19 teens, and I was really drawn to this time period because the slim, long line silhouette is unlike any other time in corset history. This is also kind of a stash busting project for me because I'm trying to get rid of a whole bunch of random little corset making supplies that I have lying around my sewing room. And I wanted to try a new pattern from a company I'd never used before. This is the Rilla corset from Scroop Patterns, and it is one of the very few corset patterns available for this time period. And I gotta admit, this was probably the fastest and easiest corset I have ever made, but just because it was easy does not mean I didn't have some problems. So I'll get to that in a minute. But first, as this is a digital pattern, I had to print it out and assemble it. And right off the bat, I'm pretty impressed with this pattern. It's multi-size and comes in two different drafts for different figures based on your waist to hip ratio. The instructions are highly thorough, and the pattern even comes with a supplemental fit guide, which is very handy for a beginner. The pattern pieces themselves have tons of placement markings, so you know exactly where to line up your bones and bust, and it even includes my all-time favorite feature, printing the seam allowance directly onto the pattern pieces themselves. It's something I can easily forget, and I hate having to look it up again in the instructions, so having it already written on the pattern pieces is top-notch. 10 out of 10 would recommend. The Rilla corset comes with a few variations. I'm doing view B, except with the upper back of view A. I started with a mock-up out of denim. This is the same fabric I used for my 1780 stays in my last video. But this time I remembered I wanted to make a separate pair of grommet strips for the back. First, I had to make sure I had enough grommets in my stash to use for both my mock-up and the final corset, because this corset requires a whopping 52 grommets. Basically, I'm cutting 2 long strips of the fabric, folding each in half lengthwise and installing a line of grommets down the center. Then I can insert these panels into the back of my mock-up to lace it up. The great thing about doing this is that I can later rip out the strips from this mock-up and reuse them in future mock-ups. I should have done this for my previous corsets, but I was just too impatient to take the time to do it. However, using the punch tool is way faster than using an awl to make the holes. I wouldn't use the punch on a final corset because cutting the fibers weakens them, but for a mock-up, it's fine. And here's my first mock-up. It's not completely boned, so it may look a little asymmetrical. Full disclosure, about halfway through assembling this, I realized I had cut a straight size 34 and forgot I needed to grade up one size in the hips. So it's no surprise my mock-up is a little too small in that area. It actually doesn't feel too small when wearing it, but looking at some key places I can tell the fit is all wrong. The center front below the bust is pulling apart badly, which is why I safety pinned it closed. But worse, my side seams are way curvier than they should be. So I let out the hips, and this was my second mock-up. Those side seams are looking more straight up and down, even though all I did was adjust the hips and not the waist or anything above. I think the too small hip area was warping the seam lines all up and down my torso. With that issue taken care of, I moved on to my final version. Since my last 2 corsets were extra fancy with silk and leather and embroidery, I thought I'd go for a more utilitarian look for this corset. Like, what would a World War I ambulance driver be wearing under her uniform? So I'm leaving off the frills for this one and going with some cotton ticking. This is the same fabric I used for my 1830s bustle I made a few months ago. It's a super tight, densely woven fabric, perfect for corsets. I'm also cutting strips for the bias binding out of the same denim from the mock-up. This is a single layer corset, no separate lining or interlining. Assembly is pretty easy, just 5 main pieces on either side, plus facings at the center, front, and back for the busk and the grommets. This long line style of corset is new for me, and it is the first time I've ever made a corset that is completely underbust. The bones don't extend the length of the corset, so you can still sit down without bones poking into your thighs. This style came into popularity around 1910-ish when the ultra slim hobble skirts became fashionable. The corset kept the hip area smooth, and even though skirts got slightly fuller as the decade went on, this corset style stuck around. I'm installing a 9-inch busk, which was the smallest length recommended. A busk that's too long would be uncomfortable when sitting down. A new thing I'm doing for this corset is using a much shorter stitch length. I watched a red threaded video examining a corset from this era, and it has very short stitches. It makes sense, this is good for structure, not so good if you have to unpick those stitches, which of course I needed to down the road. Next came grommets, and I appreciate that the pattern includes a handy guide. Since you've already seen me install grommets for the mock-up earlier, I'll save you some time watching me do that here and save me the trouble of taking the camera downstairs so I don't wake up the baby with all my hammering. The instructions have you try on the corset inside out to pin the waiststay in place, which was a technique I'd never tried before. Halfway through, I'm still quite impressed by these very detailed instructions. If you've seen my other videos, you know that a waiststay is a piece of twill tape installed to help relieve the strain on the seam lines at the waist. I marked where the waist tape will go, then trimmed the seam allowances. I'm trying my best this go around to actually follow the instructions for this pattern. Shocking, I know. I usually deviate from the original design for one reason or another, but since I wasn't trying to make this corset extra fancy, I decided to trust the pattern this time. And one of the reasons why I wanted to make this pattern in the first place is because it uses bone casing. And I still have a whole bunch of this stuff that came with a kit from my very first corset from 5 years ago. Unfortunately, this pattern calls for 3/4 inch wide casing, which this roll is not. I do, however, have a little bit of 3/4 inch wide casing left over from making a bustle, I think. I don't really remember where it came from. Unfortunately, I don't have enough of it, so I'm cutting a couple strips of the same white denim for 2 of the boning channels. These bone casings get layered directly over the seam lines, then stitched down the middle to form a bone slot on either side of each seam. Remember how I just said I was trying to follow the instructions? Well, I did this wrong at first. I switched methods for the second half of the channels, but honestly, doing this the correct way was way harder than it looks. You have to be really precise in your pinning and measurements, otherwise you'll end up with some pretty wonky stitching lines like I did, which I had to deal with later. This was definitely the most difficult portion of the project. I'm using a combo of synthetic whalebone, or what's left of my roll from my last 2 corsets, and some random other bones I have lying around from old kits. Sadly, I just don't have enough boning for all the channels, and I'm not about to go online right now and order one singular bone, but I can always add one later. In the meantime, I now have to file down all of the plastic bones, and yes, this is footage from my last corset video because it is literally the exact same process, and once again I am too lazy to lug the camera downstairs to film it. This part is where that tricky bone casing installation became a major problem. I could barely fit the bones in their slots, and some were so tight because of the less than straight stitching that I had to rip the stitching out. Remember that super short stitch length? Yeah. And then I resewed them. I'm lucky because these stitches are practically invisible from the right side of the fabric, so my mistakes aren't noticeable, but if I had to do it over again, I'd sew the entire bone casing in from the wrong side of the corset instead. I decided to use some cheap plastic boning for that one extra channel until I can get more better boning that I can replace it with. It's not as strong as steel or synthetic whalebone, but it'll be okay for now. I'm about ready to put the binding on the top and bottom edges, but this room's getting pretty messy. I've got random craft supplies, all my tools, some audio equipment. The baby's corner looks a hot mess. The baby also got into the closet into these drawers, so I need to put those back. It's really hard for me to work in a messy space, and I'm getting a little tired of this project, so I think I'm going to take a pause, do a little bit of cleanup, then come back and attach the binding. And we're in the home stretch. I'm trimming the excess from the top and bottom of the corset and attaching the binding I cut earlier. I decided to hand sew the back side of the binding in place. I knew trying to sew through 5 layers of thick cotton would be murder on my machine, and besides, I haven't done any hand sewing on this project yet, and what's a historical costume without a little hand sewing? By this point, I had run out of all my white thread except for a spool of silk thread, so I used that, but it had a tendency to snap anytime I pulled it taut. I had to tie a knot every couple inches for safety in case of breakage. I then relaced the back. This corset calls for 8 yards of lacing since it's so long. Most other corsets use about 5 yards. The grommets are one of the only sections I'm a little disappointed with. Some of the grommets are slightly off-center. I blame the seam allowance tucked inside, which made the thickness of the layers uneven, right where I needed to install the grommets. So if you use this pattern, maybe trim the seam allowances before installing the grommets. And lastly are the garters. I've never made a corset with attached garter straps before. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough elastic on hand, so I left to go pick some up. Well, I went to 2 different fabric stores and neither of them had any kind of 1-inch elastic in stock. One store didn't even have any elastic in stock except for sparkle glitter elastic for some reason. This is the only amount of white 1-inch elastic that I have. It's actually not even 1 inch, it's probably like 3/4. I do have some of this black, but it's not as strong and I don't really want to use it with this. But I only have enough length for probably 2 of these garters. It'll work for now, but I will have to get more elastic later and finish this. After my last corset project, this one came together like a dream. No multiple lining layers, no hand-sewn eyelets, no excessive fitting. I did have a couple setbacks, mainly not having enough of this or that supply, but at least I'm not in any physical pain from making this thing. While this project was relatively simple, I'm glad I got to use some new techniques and hardware, and I learned to fit an entirely different corset shape than anything else I'd made before. I'm wearing this with my 1903 combinations, which are not the correct design for this style of corset. Those legs are way too floofy for the slimmer skirts of the 19-teens, but it's the closest thing that I have for now. I was exceptionally pleased with the quality of this pattern. There aren't that many historical costuming companies, and I think we costumers are so eager to have any options at all that we'll accept some questionable drafts and lackluster instructions. The number of indie pattern companies for modern sewing have exploded recently, and the quality in that area has really improved because customers have come to expect it. So I'm glad to see similar high quality standards bleeding into the historical sewing pattern realm as well. I'm going to take a break from sewing corsets for a while to work on some other stuff, but I still have dreams for future corsets. I'd love to make a late 18th century transitional set of stays that bridges the gap between the 1780s and the Regency style. And I still have this huge roll of bone casing that I have yet to use, so I'm thinking maybe a 1890s summer mesh corset. Although I have no idea where I can find any kind of fabric that would closely match the historical original. So if you have any ideas for that, please let me know in the comments. As always, thank you so much for watching and subscribing and following me on Instagram. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you want to see more, I have a playlist of my corset videos. Bye.